So a couple years ago, Leonardo DiCaprio starred in the film The Revenant, which tells the mostly true story of a fur trapper named Hugh Glass, who is trapping, and he's attacked and severely wounded by a grizzly bear, trapping on the western frontier. His friends and kind of other fellow trappers betray him after he's attacked, leaving him for dead, and end up murdering his son right in front of his eyes. And according to the film story, and I know, spoiler alert here, so if you haven't seen it, you fully intend to, I don't know, you might want to plug your ears for a minute or so, but spoiler alert, the story goes that he lays there and severely wounded, he gets up, he walks, goes 80 miles, and on foot to hunt down and eventually kills the men who betrayed him. What's interesting, though, is that according to a film blogger who did a little bit more research, he discovered that in the real historical story, Hugh Glass travels all that way, finds his betrayers, and ends up forgiving them instead of killing them. And so in the blogosphere, they debated and talked about why Hollywood and the authors and the writers and directors changed the story, and the common conclusion is that the forgiveness narrative would be way too boring for a movie. That the natural thing to do, the obvious thing to do would be like, who could forgive in that situation? These men deserve to die, and nothing is more compelling than a good vengeance story. Okay, makes sense. Today we're talking about continuing through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' greatest sermon ever told, one of the most difficult parts of Jesus' sermon. It's the turn the other cheek portion. It is the pray for your enemies portion. We're going to talk about what that might look like in our lives in 2022 to live that out. Or maybe you heard the story of the mom who was at home with her kids one day, and the kids were off playing, and mom all of a sudden hears screams coming from the bedroom where the kids are playing, and so she runs to the bedroom to find out what is happening, and she sees the 2-year-old little girl with her brother's hair in her hands, and she is grabbing and pulling, and he's screaming and yelling, and things are happening in the room, and so she intervenes in the situation and grabs the little girl's hand and unwraps her fingers from his hair, separates the two. The little boy's crying, and he's like, I hate her. Why would she do that to me? She deserves what? And she tried to calm him down, settle him down, and said, look. It's okay. She didn't know how bad it hurt, and so we separated. You're going to be okay. Mom thinks everybody's fine, and she goes back into the kitchen, and a couple minutes later, she hears another scream. This time, obviously, the little girl screaming. She goes back in. She's like, guys, what is going on in here? And the boy says, she knows how much it hurts now. All right, here we go. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 38. Jesus. One of the most difficult parts of the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Tough words, right? And so we hear these, and we imagine them, and what happens is we begin to think like, okay, what would this look like if I were to live this out, if we were to live this out? What would it look like to live this out on a grand scale? And usually the typical response is, this is so countercultural, this is so different from everything that just kind of feels like what is natural, is that this is unrealistic. Here's what we kind of wonder about this. We say, if we, excuse me, man, voice is really dry today, so I'm just going to apologize in advance for all the times I got to turn to the water. We think things like, okay, if we all lived like this, it would turn us into doormats, right? People would realize that whatever they want to do to us, they can take advantage of us, they can hurt us, they can do whatever they want to do, we're never going to fight back. Wouldn't it just kind of turn us into doormats? Wouldn't this just kind of open up opportunities for abuse? This could allow all kinds of evil to happen with no response. And us Christians would just be known as a bunch of like passive people who never get involved. We see bad things happen and we just have to walk past it and pretend it's not happening because we're not allowed to do anything about it because Jesus said we're just supposed to always be passive. This is one of those passages that when we read this, we're like, okay, Jesus, when you're giving the Sermon on the Mount, it comes early in your ministry. Is Jesus here, does he really intend for us to live all of this out and to apply it all to our lives? Or maybe Jesus is giving us a vision for his future kingdom. And he's like, when I return and I set up my kingdom on earth and I'm there and like my throne is there and I'm reigning and everybody is submitted to me, let me tell you what life is going to look like. But that doesn't make sense either. Because if Jesus is reigning in his kingdom on earth and God's will is being done on earth as it always is in heaven, then there isn't going to be any violence, which means what he's saying here is irrelevant for that time if it's supposed to be in the future. And Jesus doesn't waste his time and words with irrelevant teaching. So I don't think this is just how we're going to live in the future. Jesus is saying, what would it look like for you to live this way right now? And so we read it, and we begin to think of all the exceptions to the rule, and what happens, I'm afraid, is that we think of 1,000 exceptions to the rule, and the 1,000 exceptions water down the rule, and we just dismiss the rule because we're so preoccupied with the exceptions, which conveniently lets us off the hook for doing hard things. So here's what I want us to do. Okay, let's just take a few things that Jesus is not suggesting here that get us hung up and tripped up over this and get us really distracted from actually listening, okay? Let's take the things that Jesus is not teaching, and we're just going to put them in the imaginary not teaching this box, okay? So that when you're like, is this really practical? Because I think this would be like, nope, that's in the not teaching box. Jesus is not teaching it, so we're not going to allow ourselves to bring it up, okay? That's not what Jesus is teaching right now, okay? So the first thing that Jesus is not saying is that if a spouse is in a really difficult situation and she or he, it happens, right, is getting beat up by their spouse, that they just have to take it, and they just have to take the abuse. If kids are being abused, they just have to take it because that's what Jesus said. And unfortunately, pastors, Bible teachers, some people have actually used this passage to say, yeah, if you're in a violent marriage and there's domestic assault situations going on, if you're a Christian, you just have to take it because Jesus said turn the other cheek. Okay, let's just take that spousal abuse. Like if that's you, get safe. Okay, it is okay to get out of there and get safe. And find a place of safety. If your kids are being abused, get them out of there, get them safe, okay? So we're going to take the abuse, we're going to put that in the not teaching box, because that Jesus is not teaching that you stay in that abusive situation and just let yourself get beat up on, okay? We got that? We're okay with that? So we're not going to let that distract us from the teaching Jesus is saying here. Okay. He also is not telling us here that if we see someone being taken advantage of or being hurt or being assaulted, that we have to just walk away because we have to be completely passive, okay? Jesus is not saying that it's wrong to defend someone else, okay? So the defend someone else, we're going to put that in the not teaching box, okay? Don't let that thought distract you. Just hear what Jesus wants you to say, okay? Jesus is also not saying that we should never go to court. Now, I know he comes close, but when you look at the rest of what Jesus says and how the early followers of Jesus put this in practice in their lives, there were times when they advocated for themselves, okay? So, the never go to court, we're going to put that in the not teaching this box. Don't let that distract you, okay? How about this one? Jesus is not teaching here that a country should not defend its borders. Okay, that's a really big conversation, a very complex conversation, but should a country defend its borders? We're just going to put that in the not teaching this. Let's not talk about that part today. That's not specifically what Jesus is talking about, okay? And the other one, I'm afraid even to bring it up. Seriously, I am, because I'm afraid just like bringing it up might plant it in your mind. But when I talk about this, people regularly bring it up. So I'm going to say this, okay? I'm going to say it quickly, and then we're going to move on. Just trust me, okay? gun control. Okay? No, whether you're for or against or you don't care, it's going to sit right here. Because if you over-politicize Jesus' message, you'll stop listening to him. Wherever you land with it, right? Okay? So, that's the box. If it's in the box, Jesus isn't talking about that right now. Why? Because we love things that let us off the hook, right? Okay, so now, with that in mind, we're going to distance ourselves from the box of stuff Jesus isn't teaching here, and we're going to listen to Jesus as he looks at each one of us in the eye and says, in your daily life, when you go to work, when you come home, when you go to the baseball field, when you walk around your neighborhood, when you call your relatives, have to deal with your mother-in-law. Are we getting close now? Yeah. Not in the box. Real life stuff here. Also here what Jesus is talking about is this is not just like general teaching about forgiveness. This is more about like training ourselves to respond differently in the moment. So that, think about this one. So that when you are at work and that supervisor who's pretty toxic, that coworker you just can't stand because they're always cutting you down, when they say something, when they do something, how will you respond in the moment? Jesus is like, now I've got your attention. That's the real live stuff that we got to talk about and hear about. Because the reality is, it literally feels good to get revenge. Did you know that? So a researcher, a social science researcher from the Virginia Commonwealth University, he has studied revenge and kind of what happens like in our brains, in our minds, in our lives when we take revenge. And so kind of doing some kind of brainwave studies in that he has discovered that a person who is insulted or who is socially rejected feels some emotional pain. And then we looked at brain activity when that emotional pain happens. They discovered that the same kind of part of the brain, and their brain was most active in the participants who, after they were hurt, went on to get some revenge and went on to kind of like take, they reacted with an aggressive response after feeling rejected. That same part of the brain was very, very active. Okay, they did some more studies, and they just kind of recognized, they're like, there is something in our body that just wants to defend ourselves. Maybe it's related to the old like fight or flight syndrome, right? And we are hurt, and so we want to lash back, lash out, and defend ourselves. And it's just like in our bodies, that is what is natural. They discovered also that emotional pain was intricately connected with pleasure. In a weird way, like get this is what they've discovered just looking at the science of it, right? That while rejection initially feels painful, it can quickly be masked by pleasure when presented with the opportunity to get revenge. And it's even kind of connected, they think, with the brain's known reward circuit, so that people who are provoked, if they react aggressively, it can create a rewarding experience in their brain. So that when we say revenge is sweet, that's actually what happens in your brain. So that when Jesus here says, I want you to respond differently, we recognize, like, this is counter to what feels natural in our bodies. That's why it's so hard. So here's what we know, okay? Immaturity looks like reacting emotionally to every situation, okay? That's just kind of what immaturity is. And so as parents, part of our job is to train our kids to move from immaturity to maturity. We just kind of discover that one of the hardest parts about parenting is teaching our kids to move and to slow down and to think and to respond rather than react. Because when we react, we just react emotionally with whatever feels natural. And what will feel natural and what your brain will reward you to do is that when you have been hurt, to react aggressively and to someone else, and your brain will actually reward that kind of behavior. And so what Jesus is suggesting here is he says, I want you to move from a place of immaturity to a place of maturity where you respond rather than react, respond in a healthy way based on what is best, what is right, and what is good, regardless of how it feels. Because your emotions, your mind, your body will say, act aggressively. Jesus says, how can I train you to respond with mercy, with grace, with forgiveness? What if you were to learn how to respond in healthy ways when you're hurt or insulted? Okay, well, let's walk through this a little bit, because part of what the challenge in this passage is kind of understanding some of these phrases and what it meant to Jesus' original hearers, and then when we understand what it meant to the original hearers, then we can kind of translate it into 2022. And so let's just kind of look at these parts here. So verse 38, you've heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And then in the Old Testament passage of this that Jesus is quoting here, which actually he quotes an Old Testament passage that's found 3 times in the Old Testament, that it would go on to say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a life for a life. Okay, this is found in the Old Testament, in which in the Old Testament we find laws not only for just kind of personal behavior and personal morality and how we should worship God, but we find laws to kind of set up a society. And so part of the challenge of the Old Testament is understanding, when was this more of like a social law that was for society to function, and when was it a personal law for an individual person? And of course, there's a lot of overlap between the two of them, but here was the rule for, here's the purpose of that law, was to let everybody know that, hey, if we're going to have a society where we maintain justice, we have to have some laws for how we treat each other, and that there is a price to pay when you hurt someone else. But at the same time, the punishment should fit the crime. And so when he kind of gives the law 3 times in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a life for a life, it kind of says 2 things. When you hurt somebody, when you take something, when you injure somebody, you should expect some kind of punishment in return. A just society cannot allow people to hurt, kill, injure others. At the same time, though, a just society makes sure that the punishment always fits the crime. And so, in a fight, someone gouges out the eye of someone else, the punishment that fits the crime is not that they lose 2 eyes, but they lose 1 eye. Pretty gross to think about. I get it. But remember, very different kind of a cultural setting. What Jesus is suggesting here, though, is even though you might claim that you have the right to do it, and you quote some Bible verse that gives you the right to do it, just because you have the right to do it doesn't always make it right. A little uncomfortable yet? Jesus is like, yep, that's what I do. How about the next one? Turn the other cheek. If anyone slaps you, do not resist the evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Okay, now to understand this one, there's a little more than just like getting in a fight or assault kind of a situation. So kind of think about this, that if I were to strike a person on their right cheek, that would be, if I'm looking at them, that would be this side, right? So how would I do that? Well, in an ancient culture that Jesus is teaching, the left hand was generally not used for kind of touching other people. You would eat with your right hand, you would do other things with your left hand. Okay, so we're going to operate with our right hand. So if I'm going to strike somebody on their right cheek with my right hand, how would I do that? I would do that with a backhand, okay? Now, in Jesus' culture, they understood what that meant. That if you approach someone who is a social equal or someone slightly under you, just the way society worked, and you were to slap them across the face with the back of your hand, it was not intended to be an assault. It wasn't intended to turn into a fight. What it was intended to be was a social insult. You've done something to me. You said something about me. I don't like you. You cheated me in a bad business deal, and so in front of everybody, I insult you and bring shame and dishonor to you. Now, based on a couple Bible verses, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, I would, if I were the person being slapped, I would have the right to slap them in return. But Jesus says, you've got that really toxic person in your life who's really difficult to deal with. We're not dealing with a situation of an assault here or an abuse, but someone who's trying to shame you, embarrass you, look down upon you, make you feel inferior. And while you could fight them back, he says, what would it look like if when they strike you on your right cheek, and everybody who sees it is like, oh, he just insulted him. He's trying to act as if he's inferior, if he's superior to him. What if, rather than fighting back, you looked him in the eye, you turned a little bit to the right, and offered him your left cheek, standing tall. And everybody who's standing around thinks, uh-oh, what's going to happen now? Will the person who thinks he is now superior, will he hit him twice? Will he turn this into a fight? Will he embarrass himself? Jesus says, what it would look like, rather than to fight back and think that you're just settling the score, what it would look like to actually be the bigger person, stand there, offer him your left cheek, and wait, and look him in the eye. Or maybe even say something like, I don't know who you think you are, but I know who I am. I am a child of God. I don't need, and I don't find my sense of worth from what other people think about me, look at me, or how they treat me, or how they speak to me. I know who I am because I know whose I am. And so you can insult me once or twice or 3 times. I know who I am. And stand firm in your confidence, in your identity of who you are as a son or daughter of God. And no matter what that person says to you or how many times they slap you in the face trying to insult you, you stand firm. Who is going to win the day in that situation? Jesus says, try it. I remember thinking though when I was a kid, I was like, so what do you do after you offer them your left cheek and they slap you on the left cheek? Jesus didn't say what you do after that. Now it's on, right? And Jesus says, remember, I'm not giving you a new set of laws here for you to think through all the new exceptions to all the rules. These aren't rules. Look at the next one. When he talks about this, the people listening, they obviously knew that there was some intentional exaggeration here when he says to them, and if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And those first century people that Jesus was talking to, well, all they had, the average person, all they had in their wardrobe was their shirt that went to the ground and their coat. And so when they were sued for their coat, and the law said that because most people only owned that, you could not even take a person's coat as a pledge that they would pay back their loan because you couldn't hold it overnight because they would need that as their blanket to sleep on. That was just how life worked, right? Jesus says when they sue you for your coat, give him your shirt also. They knew that would mean I'm stark naked. Jesus wouldn't want me to run around naked. He's obviously exaggerating here because he's trying to get my attention. He says, what's more important? Your honor or your integrity? Living differently or getting back what's yours? How about this last one here? If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. That's where we get the phrase, go the extra mile. What did this mean for these folks? Well, they understood what it meant. Is that living under Roman occupation, the law went like this, that if a Roman soldier walked up to you and ordered you to carry his gear, that you were required under law to carry it for him. 1 mile. But what do you do at the end of the mile? You know what most people did? They're carrying that gear and they're counting down the steps. They're looking at their tracker and they're like, 0.25 miles left, 0.24 miles left, 0.23. That's what I do when I run. And I'm like, oh, this is not fun. Count it down, right? They get to the 0.99, 1. Drop the gear, drop that backpack, make sure that everything in it clanks and reshuffles a little bit. They've done their duty. They walked their mile. Now I'm walking away, and there's nothing you can do about it. Jesus says, if you're one of mine, you're taking care of yourself. You're strong. Your honor is important, but your integrity is more important. You don't find your identity in being able to fight back and winning and losing in social hierarchies. You find your identity in me. Jesus says, if you're one of mine, you put that gear on and you walk and you walk and you walk and you walk that full mile and you get to the 1 mile mark and that Roman soldier is like, I'm going to catch my bag before he drops it and everything reshuffles. You just keep on walking. And you're like, sir, where are you headed? And he points the way and you just keep on walking. And he's like, what's going on? All of a sudden it's getting really uncomfortable. This follower of Jesus is carrying my gear and they're not even glaring at me. In fact, they even seem to have a good attitude about it. And he says, you go another mile. And then when you go to the end of mile 2, you don't drop it to like prove your point. You hand it back to him and say, here you go, sir, have a nice day. Maybe even add in there a little bit, Jesus loves you. And he's going to know you're the real deal because rather than demanding and doing the bare minimum and demanding your rights, you went the extra mile. Okay, that's what it meant in year 22. What does this look like in 2022? What I think we need is some real life stories that illustrate this. So I have a couple of those, and then we're going to be done for today. So here's the story of a waitress. Her name was Melina Salazar, and she was a waitress at a Luby's cafeteria. And she had a customer who was especially cranky and difficult to deal with. Walter, and they called him Buck. He would come in every day. He would come in, he would stomp his feet, he would curse, he would say mean things, he would demand that his meal get cooked. He knew what he wanted, and he wanted it the same way every day, and he demanded that his food get exactly cooked and served exactly as he wanted every day for almost 7 years. And she served him every day, quietly, offering a patient smile, and did whatever she could do to give him what he wanted. And then right before Christmas, after almost 7 years, he passed away. And she was probably thinking, too bad that he passed away, but I'm glad I don't have to deal with his grumpy, demanding behavior anymore. Until his will was read, and it was discovered that he left her his Buick and $50,000. Now, even if he wouldn't have left her anything, the right thing to do was take up the words of Jesus and say, I'm going to serve him. I'm not in danger. He's not going to injure me. But this is hard. He's mistreating me. She served him well. And in the end, she was rewarded. Jesus' way worked for a waitress. Can it work on a larger level? This is not 2022, 20 years ago or so, but Gaston Thomas, maybe not 20 years ago, a while ago. Gaston Thomas, well, he led one of the few churches that emerged in Baghdad after Saddam Hussein's regime was toppled, and here's his story. His congregation, they put a sign on their building that said, Jesus is the light of the world. And in those days when there was kind of an absence of power and who was going to gain power and who's going to be in charge, one of the nights the church was raided by bandits who also left their threat on a piece of cardboard. And it said this, Jesus is not the light of the world, Allah is, and you have been warned. And it was signed the Islamic Shiite Party. So what did Pastor Gassan do? He loaded up a van with children's gifts and with medical supplies. Two things that he recognized were in short supply following the invasion and the toppling and the war and all the chaos that was happening in their country. Loads up a van with children's gifts and medical supplies. He drove it to the headquarters of the Islamic Shiite Party. And after presenting his gifts and supplies to the sheikh, he told the leader, Christians have love for you because our God is a God of love. He asked for permission to read from the Bible, and he read from John chapter 8, where he read the words of Jesus, I am the light of the world. And then he showed the piece of cardboard to the sheikh that the Muslim leaders had left. And the leader apologized. And he said to him, "This will not happen again," the sheik vowed. "You are my brother, and if anyone comes to kill you, it will be my neck first." Later on, the same sheik attended Pastor Thomas's ordination service at the church. So it worked for a waitress. Jesus' way also worked for a pastor in Iraq. I think it could work for you. How about another news story discovered? A family came home and discovered that there was a lot of noise and unpleasant yelling coming from their neighbor's home, and something was going on, something was bad, something was chaotic. And so they went over to the house and he just kind of said, "Hey, are you okay? We don't like the noise and the yelling and the bad language and everything that's kind of coming from your house. You need to kind of knock it off and cut it down, or cut it down, knock it off." And the guy who owned the home then came outside of the house, and he came outside of the house holding a machete with the word kindness written on the machete. And he started swinging the machete around, and one of the neighbors tackled him, was injured. He was arrested and eventually, released after he was charged. I guess he didn't quite understand what killing them with kindness meant, took that the wrong way. This is not what that means, and obviously didn't try it Jesus' way. Okay, think about this, though. Think about this. In those moments where we want to get back and take revenge, what do we really want? We want to get our honor back. We want to get our stuff back. We want to get our reputation back. We want to get even. Because the narrative we've been told is that if you want to win in life, you got to get what's yours and hold on to it. That's how you win in life. The reality, though, is the more you fight for what's yours, usually end up miserable with not very many friends. Reflected another true story. Back in 1966, two black men strode into a grill in New Jersey and shot 3 people to death. Reuben Hurricane Carter was a celebrated black boxer at the time. He was an acquaintance with the men who went in and committed the crime, and he was falsely charged and wrongly convicted of the murder. The trial was highly publicized, highly racially charged. He was fiercely outspoken and maintained his claims of innocence, became his own jailhouse lawyer, and 19 years later was released. And so the question he said that he gets all the time from people, after serving 19 years, falsely convicted, falsely accused, and people say, "Reuben, are you bitter?" And here's what he says, because think about it. Here's the question: what do you really want? He says, if I've learned nothing else in my life, I've learned that bitterness only consumes the vessel that contains it. And for me to permit bitterness to control or to infect my life in any way whatsoever would be to allow those who imprisoned me to take even more than the 22 years that they've already taken. That would make me an accomplice to their crime. What do you really want? I think Jesus knew that those who spend their lives keeping score, always making sure to get even and a little bit more so they can be winning, aren't really winning. So Jesus goes on. He says, how about this? You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But did you know that the only part that was actually in the Bible is the love your neighbor part? The Old Testament didn't say hate your neighbor. That's just people assumed. Okay, if we have to love our enemies, if we have to love our neighbors, now we know who we can hate. Anybody who's not our neighbor. Hate your enemy. But I tell you, here's something even better. Try this. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love only those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? Everybody does that. If you greet only your own kind of people, what good are you doing more than others? Don't even the pagans do that? Everybody who says they're a good person says, I love my family and friends. He says, I want you to go beyond that. Don't settle for normal. Love your neighbor. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Last story, Julio Diaz. He's a social worker in New York City, and he has a daily routine. Every year he gets done with his office job, he gets on the train, and he rides back to his apartment in the Bronx. He stops one stop early so he can stop at his favorite diner and have dinner. But one time in the middle of the winter, he stopped, he got off his train, and he walked down, got off the platform. It took an unexpected turn. He found a teenage boy who had a knife and demanded money. And so this 31-year-old social worker took out his wallet, gave him his wallet, and said, here you go. As the kid began to walk away, he called out after him. He said, hey, wait a minute. You forgot something. If you're going to be robbing people for the rest of the night, you might as well take my coat to keep you warm. And gave him his coat. Well, at this point, the kid was really confused, looked at him, and he said, Mister, why are you doing this? Julio Diaz replies, look, if you're willing to risk your freedom for a few dollars, I guess you really must need some money. I mean, all I wanted to do was get dinner. Well, if you want to join me, you're more than welcome. And he brought him to the diner. He sat down. They had dinner together. They talked, and he bought him a meal. Jesus' way, it worked out for both Julio Diaz and the young boy. He could have tried to fight back. He could have settled the score. Maybe he would have won. He wouldn't have won a new friend. He would not have won an enemy, though. And so, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The context in the Old Testament was for maintaining justice in a society. And in those ancient societies, they were small villages, not large cities and large suburbs. They were small villages based on relational connections. And so justice was personal. The next of kin was responsible for avenging the death of a relative. But you know how that goes. Our body's internal chemistry, we've already talked about it, kind of rewards that aggressive behavior. And often they took it too far and began this cycle of revenge that often never ends until someone says enough is enough. And so an eye for an eye tried to rein in justice so that it was less emotional and less of revenge and more justice. But does it work? Usually not. Modern society that we live in, justice tends to be more institutional. We have standing armies, we have police forces, and we have judicial systems. And yes, often those systems are inefficient, sometimes they're broken, and it's really complex and really messy. But we do that so that we can talk about blind justice to try to take the emotion out of the situation so that it's more justice and less revenge. And you know, as I've talked to men and women over the years, I've discovered that two of the hardest jobs are folks who serve in the military and folks who serve in law enforcement. A couple of reasons why. Folks who serve in the military only works with a clear chain of command and control. And it is yes, sir, and you do what you're told right when you're told, because that's how it works when you're at war. It doesn't work very well at home. And often our best soldiers, they'll do great at their job, and then they go home and they struggle to be husband and dad. Because yes, sir, and command and control doesn't work too great when you have teenagers. And they struggle. We got to pray for them, support them, and love them because it's really hard. Our law enforcement, they go to work every day, and they get to interact with violence, crime, sadness, pain, unending. And they arrest a criminal. Next week, they're back in the streets again. And it's frustrating, and it's discouraging. I had a friend of mine. He spent time in both the military and then in federal law enforcement. And we'd go hunting and hang out together sometimes, and we'd be like, how do you do it, man? How do you drive down the street and see crime happening, see all bad things happening, and just know that, how do you do it? And he said, you know what? You just have to learn that when I'm not wearing the badge, I'm not wearing the badge. Here's what this looks like for you. When somebody hurts us, we want justice. And we think that it would be better to revert back to the small systems and small colonies where justice is personal and where you get justice. And I think what Jesus says is, in any given situation, which would you rather do? Put on your justice hat, take your badge, and get justice in every situation? Or could it be that as a follower of Jesus, a better way to live is to let the police do their job, let the judicial system, as broken as it is, do its job, let the soldiers do their job. As a follower of me, Jesus says, you take off your self-given badge, you take off your justice hat, and wear your mercy and grace hat. Because that's what Jesus did. Jesus says, what it would look like, what would it look like if the people who are called Christians would take off their justice hat, take off their self-given badges, and put on their mercy hat and their grace hat in every relationship, in every situation, everywhere they go, every time somebody says something mean to them, every time somebody says something insulting to them, and in every situation. I'm not here to maintain justice. I'm here to offer mercy. I'm here to offer grace. What would the world look like? What would your life look like? Let's pray together. So the first thing I want you to do as we pray is I want you to think about that person in your life who is a challenge. If you would label them your enemy, well, label them your enemy. If you struggle like, I don't have any enemies, well, who would be the closest thing to it? Someone who's a challenge in your life. And I want you to pray for God's blessing on them. When Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, I want you to pray a prayer of blessing over them. And now I want you to take that little cup of bread and juice that you received when you came in, and I want you to open up the top and peel off the top layer. Take the bread. By the way, if you didn't get one, we have plenty. Sadie and Miranda, they're right in the back there, so now would be the time to go ahead and grab one. And then peel off the next layer, and that'll get you to the juice. And so for 2,000 years, followers of Jesus, who struggle with the times they're insulted and hurt, they've been taking little pieces of bread and little cups of juice that represent the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. That represent what Jesus did for us on the cross when he died for us. And when Jesus blessed us, his enemies, who living in sin were doing our own thing, going our own way, and he gave his life through his broken body and his shed blood. And if you're a follower of Jesus, as an enemy of God, when you were enemies with God, the Bible says, Jesus showed his love for us in this. He gave his life for us. And so you prayed for a blessing for your enemies because you and I have been blessed as God's enemies. God, I pray, would you take these bits of bread and juice in our hands, and may they be so much more than just little bites of food. But Lord, would you make them powerful spiritual reminders that the good news that guides our life is that you loved us so much you gave your life for us. And hey, as we're getting ready to worship, sing and pray and take these elements today, if you have never turned your life over to Jesus, I want to invite you to do it now. If you've been on the fence wondering and waiting, and what does it mean to follow Jesus? Here's what it means, is to say, Jesus, you died on the cross, and I accept what you did for me. Please forgive my sins. Come into my life, clean me up, make me brand new. I believe in you, Lord Jesus. And so you don't have to be a member of our church to partake in communion. All we ask is that you are trusting in Jesus Christ. And as you have received forgiveness of your sins and received the leadership of Jesus in your life, that as you receive this food and drink, it is an outward symbol of the inner decision you've made in your heart. Jesus, make this bread and this juice your body and your blood. And so take the bread. Let it be the body of our Lord Jesus, which was broken for you. May it preserve you blameless unto everlasting life. Take and eat in remembrance that Christ has died for you. You may eat. Take the cup. Let it be for you the blood of Christ, which was shed for you, and may it preserve you blameless unto everlasting life. Drink this in remembrance that Christ's blood was shed for you, and be thankful. You may drink.